The lawyer arrived before my pain medication did. I noticed because my mouth was dry and my hands were still shaking, and the nurse had promised she would be back in a moment. Instead, the door opened quietly and a man in a dark suit stepped in, holding a thin leather folder against his chest as if it were something fragile. He smiled politely, the way professionals do when they are entering a room where grief is expected, but not yet acknowledged. Behind him, my son followed without hesitation. He didn't look surprised to see the lawyer there. That was when I understood this visit had not been arranged for my comfort. I lay still, listening to the soft beep of the monitor, feeling the weight of the blanket press against my legs. My son stood near the window, his reflection faint in the glass, shoulders straight, posture controlled. He asked if this was a good time, not to me, but to the lawyer. I wanted to say no. I wanted to say I was tired, that my chest still hurt, that my thoughts were foggy, but the words stayed inside me, slow and heavy. The lawyer nodded and said we would keep it brief. He pulled a chair closer to the bed, careful not to touch anything, and sat down. I tried to read my son's face. It looked familiar, yet distant, like a photograph taken long ago. He had my late husband's jaw, the same stubborn set when he thought he was being reasonable. I remembered when he was small and would crawl into my bed after a nightmare, pressing his cold feet against my legs. I remembered how he used to ask me to tell the same story again and again, the one about the house we would someday live in by the water. That house existed now, along with several others, though he had never asked about the story again. The lawyer cleared his throat and said my name. He spoke gently, slowly, as if explaining something to a child. He mentioned documents, assets, and planning. He said it was wise to review certain matters while I was still lucid. That word caught me off guard. Lucid. I wondered if my son had used it earlier when speaking to him on the phone. I wondered how long they had been discussing me as a concept rather than a person. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I wanted him to continue so I could understand what was being done in my presence. My son finally turned toward me. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said this was just a formality, that it would make things easier later. He said I wouldn't have to worry about anything. I thought about how worry had been my constant companion for decades, how it had shaped every decision I made while building the life he now spoke of as if it were already his responsibility. I asked him what exactly we were discussing. My voice sounded smaller than I expected, thin and tired. He hesitated for just a moment, then said the word inheritance. He said it carefully, respectfully, as if tone could soften its meaning. He explained that given the size of my estate, it would be better to clarify intentions sooner rather than later. He mentioned a number, 25 million, as if it were a line item, not the sum of a lifetime of work, sacrifice, and restraint. The lawyer nodded along, eyes flicking between us, waiting for my response. I looked at the ceiling again. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly, and I counted the seconds between the beeps of the monitor. I realized no one had asked me how I felt. No one had asked if I was afraid. They had come prepared, folders in hand, words chosen in advance, assuming my consent would follow naturally from my condition. I thought about the years after my husband died, how quiet the house had been, how I learned to fill the silence with routine and discipline. I thought about how my son had visited less and less as his own life grew larger, busier, more demanding. The lawyer asked if I remembered signing certain documents years ago. I said yes. I remembered everything. I remembered sitting alone at my desk late at night, reading clauses slowly, making decisions with a clear mind and steady hand. I remembered choosing patience over generosity, foresight over comfort. I didn't say any of this out loud. I simply told him I remembered. My son exhaled, relieved, as if that confirmation was enough to move things forward. He asked how soon the funds could be accessed. He said it wasn't urgent, but his voice betrayed him. There was an edge there, a subtle pressure, the expectation of cooperation. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not sadness, but clarity, a quiet understanding of where I stood in this room, in this moment. I realized I was being measured not by my presence, but by my utility. Before I could answer, the nurse finally returned with the medication. She apologized for the delay, unaware of the shift that had already occurred. The lawyer closed his folder and stood, saying we could continue another time. My son nodded, already stepping back, already done with the conversation now that it had been initiated. As they left, he told me to rest, that we would talk soon. The door closed softly behind them. I swallowed the pills and felt the dulling begin. My thoughts slowed, but the clarity remained. I stared at the empty chair beside my bed and wondered how long this conversation had been waiting for me to fall ill. I wondered what else had been decided without me. And for the first time since waking in that hospital room, I understood that whatever came next would not be about my recovery. The medication softened the edges of the room, but it did not erase what had been said. When I woke later, the light outside the window had changed, thinner and more gray, as if the day had decided not to commit. A volunteer came in to adjust the flowers, replacing the water, trimming stems that had already begun to curl. She spoke kindly, asking if anyone would be visiting later. I told her I wasn't sure. She smiled in a way that suggested she had heard that answer many times before. When she left, the room returned to its careful quiet, the kind that presses against the ears. My son did not come back that day. No message followed, no call to ask how the tests had gone. I told myself he was busy, that people with full lives often forget the small details. Still, I watched the door each time footsteps passed, expecting him to appear, prepared to pretend nothing unusual had occurred. I practiced responses in my head, polite and restrained, the way I had learned to speak when emotions threatened to spill over. I reminded myself that I was an adult woman, not a child waiting for reassurance, yet the waiting remained, stubborn and humiliating. The doctors spoke to me in measured tones. They explained procedures and timelines, probabilities and risks. I listened carefully, asked questions, nodded when appropriate. It occurred to me that these strangers knew more about my condition than my own son seemed to care to learn. One of the nurses mentioned she had a boy about his age. She said she couldn't imagine not being there if he were in my place. She didn't say it unkindly, but the words lingered after she left. I wondered what it was about me that made absence seem acceptable. I thought about the years leading up to this moment, the subtle shifts that had gone unnoticed until they were too large to ignore. How phone calls became shorter, then rarer. How visits were scheduled between obligations, never around them. How conversations drifted toward logistics rather than lives. I had told myself it was natural, that children grow away from their parents, not toward them. I had been proud of his independence, proud of his success. I had never wanted to be a burden. Perhaps I had made it too easy not to be needed. At night, when the ward quieted and the machines hummed in unison, I replayed the lawyer's presence in my mind. The smooth leather folder, the careful phrasing, the assumption that I would cooperate. I wondered who had suggested the timing. I wondered whether my illness had been discussed as an opportunity rather than a concern. These thoughts embarrassed me. They felt uncharitable, even paranoid. I reminded myself that love does not always look the way we expect it to. Still, something inside me refused to settle. On the third day, my son sent a text asking if I was feeling stronger. I stared at the message longer than necessary, considering how to respond. I typed a simple yes, then erased that. I typed another, mentioning the tests, then erased that too. Finally, I wrote that I was resting and hoped he was well. He replied with a thumbs up emoji. I placed the phone face down on the tray table and felt a strange sense of finality, as if a door had quietly closed without being slammed. A social worker stopped by to discuss discharge planning. She asked about support at home, about who would be there during recovery. I hesitated, then told her I managed well on my own. She nodded, making notes, her pen scratching softly across the paper. I realized how practiced I had become at presenting strength, how easily I dismissed the idea of needing anyone. It had been years since someone had insisted on staying, years since anyone had asked if I wanted company rather than assuming I preferred solitude. When I was finally discharged, my son did not pick me up. He arranged a car service instead, efficient and impersonal. The driver was polite, helping me into the back seat, asking if the temperature was comfortable. As the hospital receded in the distance, I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart. I watched familiar streets pass by, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The city felt indifferent, steady in its movement, unconcerned with my private reckoning. At home, the house greeted me with its usual order. Everything was where it belonged, untouched and quiet. I moved slowly from room to room, reacquainting myself with the space, the weight of my own footsteps. On my desk lay a stack of unopened mail, neatly arranged. Among them was an envelope bearing the law firm's name. I did not open it. I placed it back on the desk and sat down, listening to the silence I had cultivated so carefully over the years. As evening fell, I made tea and sat by the window, watching the lights come on across the street. I thought about the question the volunteer had asked, about whether anyone would be visiting. I thought about the lawyer's timing, about my son's expectations. I realized that whatever assumptions were being made about me, they rested on the belief that I would remain passive, grateful, compliant. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and stared into the darkening glass, knowing that the quiet I had once relied on was about to be tested in ways I had not yet named. The invitation arrived a week later, tucked inside a thick cream envelope with my son's name embossed in gold. I noticed the weight of it before I noticed the words, how deliberate it felt, how confident. For a moment, I simply held it, resting my thumb along the edge, letting myself imagine what it might contain before opening it. When I finally did, I found an announcement written in careful, celebratory language. My son was getting married. The date was circled in my mind immediately, close enough that my recovery would still be visible, far enough that I would be expected to manage. There was a line about family and togetherness, about how much it would mean to have me there. I read that sentence twice, slower the second time, as if reading it differently might change its meaning. I sat at the table for a long while after, the invitation lying flat before me like a promise that could still be kept. I told myself this was an olive branch, that perhaps the hospital had been a misunderstanding, poorly handled but not intentional. Weddings have a way of making people sentimental. They invite reflection, reconciliation. I imagined standing quietly at the back, watching my son take a step into his future, proud in the way mothers are supposed to be. I imagined he would introduce me to people with a hand on my arm, that he would smile at me the way he used to when he was younger and unsure. These images came easily, perhaps too easily, and I let them stay longer than they deserved. In the days that followed, my son called more often. Not long conversations, but enough to suggest attention. He asked how I was feeling, whether the doctor had cleared me to travel. He mentioned seating arrangements, logistics, the venue. I answered politely, carefully, aware of how fragile this renewed contact felt. Each call ended with the sense that something else might be said, something important, but never was. Still, I found myself looking forward to the sound of the phone, adjusting my day around the possibility of his voice. It surprised me how quickly hope could return, how quietly it could undo resolve. The wedding was held at a large estate outside the city, manicured and immaculate. I arrived early, wanting to avoid attention, wanting time to settle. The air smelled of cut grass and flowers arranged to appear effortless. Guests moved in clusters, laughing easily, dressed in fabrics that caught the light. I recognized very few faces. When I did see my son, he was surrounded, already in motion, already belonging elsewhere. He greeted me briefly, kissing my cheek, his attention divided. He thanked me for coming, as if attendance were a favor rather than a given. Before I could respond, someone called his name and he turned away, leaving me standing with my purse held close against my side. I found my seat without assistance. It was not where I had expected to be placed, not near the front, not among immediate family, but several rows back, flanked by strangers who glanced at me politely before resuming their conversations. I told myself it didn't matter, that seating was complicated, that no slight was intended. As the ceremony began, I focused on the music, on the careful pacing, on the way my son stood tall at the altar. I felt a familiar mixture of pride and distance, a recognition that his life had moved beyond me in ways that could not be bridged by presence alone. During the reception, I noticed the way conversations shifted when I approached, how smiles tightened, how people seemed unsure of who I was. Eventually, someone asked directly. A woman with a bright laugh and a glass of champagne leaned in and said, "And how do you know the groom?" The question landed harder than it should have. I answered simply, "I'm his mother." She blinked, surprised, then laughed lightly, saying she hadn't realized. She gestured toward the head table, suggesting I should be closer. I smiled and said nothing. Dinner passed slowly. Toasts were made, stories shared. I learned things about my son I had never been told, anecdotes from colleagues and friends who spoke with familiarity. When the best man raised his glass, he joked about how my son had always been driven, always focused on building something bigger. He mentioned how fortunate he was to have such a strong support system, how everything had fallen into place at just the right time. My eyes drifted to the head table, to my son's new wife, radiant and assured. I wondered what version of me she had been told about, if any at all. Later, I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. Two guests stood near the terrace doors, their voices lowered, but not enough. One mentioned the estate, the businesses, the inheritance. The other laughed, saying it was practically settled already, that my son had things well in hand. They spoke with certainty, with the casual confidence of people repeating what they believed to be common knowledge. I felt the words settle around me, heavy and unmistakable. No one corrected them. No one noticed me standing there listening. I left before the dancing began. I did not say goodbye. The driver found me at the gate, coat already on, expression neutral. As we pulled away, I watched the lights of the estate recede, the celebration continuing without pause. I rested my head against the window and closed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion seep in. It wasn't physical. It was the kind that comes from holding oneself upright through quiet humiliations, from realizing that hope had been extended not as a bridge, but as a test. Back home, I placed the wedding program on my desk beside the unopened envelope from the law firm. I did not cry. I made tea, sat in my chair, and let the silence return. But it felt different now, charged, observant. I understood that whatever I had imagined rebuilding was not mine to decide, and as I sat there replaying the words I had overheard, I knew that something had shifted beyond repair, even if no one else had yet noticed. In the days after the wedding, my son did not call. I did not expect him to. The silence felt deliberate now, shaped by choice rather than oversight. I moved through my routines carefully, as if sudden movements might cause something fragile to shatter. Each morning I woke early, made breakfast I barely touched, read the paper without absorbing much of it. I found myself lingering over small tasks, folding laundry that didn't need folding, arranging books that were already in order. The house seemed to sense the shift, holding its breath along with me. Friends sent polite messages about the wedding. They commented on the photographs they had seen, on how handsome my son looked, how beautiful the setting was. I replied with brief acknowledgments, thanking them, saying it had been lovely. I did not correct their assumptions. I did not mention where I had been seated or how early I had left. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who believe you are included. I carried that feeling quietly, like a secret I was responsible for keeping. A few days later, I received another call from the law firm. The same calm voice, the same careful phrasing. The lawyer asked if I had had time to consider our previous discussion. He said there were matters that would benefit from clarity, especially given recent changes in my family's circumstances. The word recent lingered between us. I asked him what exactly needed clarification. He spoke about timelines, about ensuring continuity, about minimizing complications. He did not mention my son by name, but his presence was unmistakable. I told him I would review the documents and get back to him. He sounded relieved, as if progress had been made. After the call, I sat at my desk and finally opened the envelope that had been waiting. Inside were copies of documents I recognized, along with notes in the margins, suggestions neatly typed. I read slowly, carefully, letting each sentence settle. There was nothing overtly alarming, nothing that suggested urgency beyond what had already been implied. And yet the assumption threaded through every page was unmistakable. Decisions were being anticipated on my behalf. My cooperation was being treated as inevitable. I thought about the wedding again, about the moment I had overheard those guests speaking so confidently about my affairs. I wondered how far that confidence extended, how many conversations had taken place without me, how many plans were already in motion based on the belief that I would not object. The realization did not make me angry, it made me tired, a deep, bone-level fatigue that had nothing to do with age. One afternoon, I decided to visit my son unannounced. It was an impulse I had not indulged in years. I told myself it was reasonable, that mothers were allowed to stop by, especially after significant events. I dressed carefully, choosing something neutral, unobtrusive. When I arrived, his building's lobby was bright and impersonal, all glass and polished stone. The security desk asked me to wait while they called upstairs. I stood there, purse clasped in both hands, watching people pass by without seeing me. When my son came down, his expression shifted quickly, surprise giving way to composure. He asked if everything was all right. The question felt procedural. I told him I had wanted to see him, to talk. He glanced at his watch, then said he had a meeting soon, but we could walk for a few minutes. Outside, the city noise wrapped around us, filling the gaps in conversation. I asked how married life was treating him. He said it was good, busy, exciting. He asked about my health, then moved on before I could answer fully. I told him I had felt a little lost at the wedding. I chose my words carefully, keeping my voice even. I said I hadn't known many people, that I hadn't been sure where I fit. He frowned slightly, said it had been a hectic day, that things had probably slipped through the cracks. He said he assumed I would understand. That word again, understand. I asked him what exactly he thought I would understand. He hesitated, then said I had always been independent, that I didn't like fuss. He said he thought I preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Something inside me tightened then, not sharply, but firmly, like a door being closed with intention. I realized how thoroughly my silence had been interpreted as consent. how my restraint had been mistaken for absence. I told him I did not feel invisible by choice. I said it quietly, without accusation. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight, scanning the street as if searching for an exit. He said he hadn't meant it that way. He said things were complicated. He said we would talk more later. Before we parted, he mentioned the lawyer again. He said it would be good to get things settled, to avoid misunderstandings. He said it would give him peace of mind. I nodded because nodding had become easier than arguing. We hugged briefly, awkwardly, our bodies unfamiliar with the gesture. As he walked away, I watched him merge into the crowd, indistinguishable from anyone else. That evening, I sat alone and replayed the conversation. I recognized the pattern now, the careful deflection, the way concern was expressed just enough to avoid accountability. I felt a quiet breaking inside me, not dramatic, not loud, just a recognition that whatever role I had imagined for myself in his life no longer existed. I had been reduced to a consideration, a variable to be managed. I did not cry. I cleaned the kitchen, washed the cup I had used earlier, dried it carefully before placing it back in the cupboard. I returned to my desk and arranged the documents into a neat stack. I did not make any decisions. I simply sat there, listening to the house settle around me, aware that endurance alone would no longer be enough. Something else would be required. And though I had not yet named it, I felt it waiting, patient and observant, just beyond the edge of the silence. I began to notice how much of my life had been built on watching rather than speaking. The days took on a slower rhythm after that meeting, as if time itself had decided to tread carefully. I woke early, not from worry, but from habit, and sat at the kitchen table long before the sun rose fully. I drank my tea slowly, listening to the house as it shifted with temperature and light. There was comfort in these small sounds, reminders that something steady still existed. I did not rush to fill the quiet anymore. I let it sit with me, unchallenged. I stopped answering messages immediately. When friends asked how I was doing, I told them I was recovering, which was true in ways they did not need explained. When my son sent a brief note about schedules or documents, I replied politely, briefly, without inviting further discussion. I noticed how quickly he adjusted to that distance, how easily the exchange became transactional. There were no follow-up questions, no concern that my responses had changed in tone. It confirmed what I had already begun to accept. I spent more time at my desk, not working in the way I once had, but reviewing old files, correspondence, records that spanned decades. I did not rush through them. I allowed myself to remember the circumstances behind each decision, the reasons I had chosen caution where others might have chosen generosity. I remembered the early years after my husband died, when every choice carried weight, when I learned to rely on my own judgment because there was no one else to defer to. Those memories returned without bitterness. They felt instructive rather than painful. Occasionally, the lawyer's voice echoed in my mind, his calm assurance that clarity would benefit everyone. I did not dispute that. Clarity had always mattered to me. I simply questioned who it was meant to serve. I resisted the urge to respond quickly, to prove cooperation. Instead, I allowed time to pass. Days stretched into weeks. No one pressed me. No ultimatums were issued. That silence spoke volumes. It suggested confidence, the belief that I would act eventually, predictably. I took walks in the late afternoon, choosing routes I had not taken in years. I noticed changes in the neighborhood, new buildings, different faces. I liked the anonymity of it, the sense that my history was not visible to passers-by. On one of these walks, I passed a small park where a mother sat on a bench watching her child play. The child ran back and forth, occasionally glancing over to make sure she was still there. The mother smiled each time, offering reassurance without words. I felt something stir then, not envy, but recognition. There had been a time when my presence alone had been enough. At home, I reorganized drawers and cabinets, not because they needed it, but because the process allowed me to think without interruption. I found old photographs tucked into envelopes, images of my son at different ages, his expressions changing as he grew. In each picture, he was looking outward, towards something unseen. I wondered when I had stopped being part of that direction. I placed the photographs back where I found them, unwilling to discard them, but equally unwilling to display them. My health continued to improve, slowly and steadily. Follow-up appointments were uneventful, doctors seemed pleased, nurses encouraging. Each time someone commented on my resilience, I thanked them and moved on. I did not mention how much of that resilience had been cultivated through necessity. Strength, I had learned, often develops quietly, unnoticed until it is required. One afternoon, a courier delivered another envelope from the law firm. This one contained a polite reminder, nothing more. I read it once, then placed it in a drawer without responding. I felt no urgency, no guilt. The absence of pressure confirmed my suspicion that the outcome was assumed. I wondered how it would feel to disrupt that assumption, not dramatically, not confrontationally, but simply by existing outside of it. The thought lingered, unformed but persistent. I began to sleep better. The nights were no longer filled with replayed conversations or imagined explanations. When thoughts arose, I acknowledged them and let them pass. I understood now that waiting for recognition from someone unwilling to offer it was a form of self-neglect. That realization did not harden me, it steadied me. When my son called again, weeks later, his tone was casual, almost cheerful. He spoke about an upcoming trip, about how busy things had been. He asked if I had received the documents. I said yes. He paused, then asked what I thought. I told him I was considering them. He accepted that answer without protest. The call ended shortly after, polite and contained. As I set the phone down, I noticed my hands were steady. That evening, I sat by the window again, watching the familiar pattern of lights across the street. I felt no urge to fill the silence with justification or regret. I was aware, perhaps for the first time in a long while, of my own presence as something complete. Whatever assumptions were being made elsewhere, whatever plans were unfolding without my input, they no longer defined the pace of my days. I had not revealed anything, I had not decided anything, but beneath the calm surface of routine, something deliberate was taking shape, patient and unresolved, waiting for the right moment to move. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes when nothing is demanded of you. I began to recognize it in the quiet moments, when the phone did not ring and the mail brought nothing urgent. I no longer felt watched, no longer felt the need to anticipate anyone else's expectations. The days settled into a rhythm that belonged solely to me. I rose, ate, walked, read, rested. I kept my appointments and canceled none. I answered questions when asked and offered nothing extra. It was not withdrawal, it was containment. I stopped thinking of my son in terms of disappointment and began to see him as he was, not cruel, not malicious, simply certain. Certain that things moved in one direction, certain that time resolved all hesitations, certain that I would continue to be reasonable, quiet, accommodating. That certainty had served him well in life. It had allowed him to move quickly, to act without doubt. I understood now that it had also made him careless. I visited the bank one morning without telling anyone. It was not a dramatic decision. I had been meaning to go for months, to update a minor detail, nothing more. The building was familiar, unchanged, and the staff greeted me by name. We spoke politely. I asked a few questions, listened carefully to the answers. There was no tension in the room, no sense of confrontation. I thanked them and left. No one followed up, no one needed to. After that, I made a habit of revisiting places that had once required my full attention, offices, records, archives of my own making. I did not announce myself. I did not ask for favors. I simply showed up, as I always had. People were respectful, efficient. They assumed I knew what I was doing. That assumption felt earned. I carried it with me quietly, like a reminder of a version of myself that had never disappeared, only stepped back. At home, I became more deliberate about what I kept within reach and what I stored away. Some documents remained on my desk, others were filed carefully, labeled in my own handwriting. I did not rush. I read slowly, sometimes more than once. I paid attention to language, to phrasing, to what was stated plainly and what was implied. Years of running a business had taught me that meaning often lives in the margins. I took notes, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to remember how I arrived at each conclusion. My son called again, this time with a softer tone. He asked how I was feeling. I told him the truth, that I was stronger. He said he was glad. There was a pause, longer than usual. He mentioned that things had been hectic, that married life came with adjustments. I listened. I did not offer reassurance. Eventually, he returned to the topic he had been circling. He said the lawyer had reached out, that they were hoping to finalize a few things. He said it would be a relief to have everything settled. I said I understood. After the call, I sat for a long time without moving. I realized at no point had he asked what I wanted. Not recently, not during the wedding, not in the hospital. The absence of the question felt more telling than any demand. I wondered when it had stopped occurring to him that my desires might differ from his expectations. I wondered if it ever would again. I took another walk that afternoon, slower than usual. The air had cooled, carrying the smell of rain. I passed a bookstore I had not entered in years and went inside on impulse. I wandered the aisles without purpose, touching spines, reading fragments. I bought a small notebook, plain and unassuming. At home, I wrote nothing in it. I placed it in a drawer and closed it. The act felt complete even without words. There were moments, fleeting and uninvited, when doubt surfaced, when I questioned whether my silence might be misinterpreted, whether my restraint might cause unnecessary distance. In those moments, I reminded myself of the wedding, of the seating chart, of the conversation overheard. I reminded myself of the hospital room and the leather folder. These were not misunderstandings, they were patterns. Recognizing a pattern is not bitterness, it is awareness. Another letter arrived from the law firm, more formal this time, suggesting a meeting. I did not decline, I did not accept immediately. I placed it on my desk and continued with my day. The sun moved through the room, light shifting over paper and wood. I felt no urgency. Whatever was coming would wait until I was ready. In the evenings, I began to sit without distraction. No radio, no television, just the sounds of the house and my own breathing. I thought about the life I had built, the choices that had brought me here. I did not regret my generosity, nor did I regret my restraint. Both had been necessary at different times. What I regretted, if anything, was how easily I had allowed myself to be edited out of my own narrative. That realization did not wound me, it instructed me. When my son sent a message asking when he might be free to meet with a lawyer, I replied that I would let him know. He responded quickly, saying there was no rush, that they could work around my schedule. The words were polite, but I sensed the underlying impatience. I closed the message and set the phone aside. As night fell, I stood by the window once more, watching the familiar lights blink on. The city continued as it always had, indifferent and reliable. I felt grounded in a way I had not in months. Nothing had been revealed, nothing had been explained, yet beneath the stillness a quiet alignment was forming, not fueled by anger or revenge, but something far steadier. I knew that when the time came to speak, I would do so calmly, and I knew that what I would say would change everything, even if my voice never rose above a whisper. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the law firm's main office downtown. I arrived early, as I always do, and took a seat in the waiting area overlooking the street. People moved below with purpose, unaware of how often lives shift quietly behind glass and polished wood. When my son arrived, he looked relieved to see me there already, as if punctuality itself signaled cooperation. He kissed my cheek, asked if I was comfortable, then began speaking about traffic and schedules. I listened without comment. The lawyer joined us moments later, the same man from the hospital, carrying the same thin folder. He ushered us into a conference room and gestured for us to sit. The table was long, reflective, its surface free of clutter except for neatly arranged documents. Everything about the room suggested order, foresight, inevitability. The lawyer thanked me for coming and said he appreciated my willingness to address matters proactively. My son nodded, folding his hands, his posture confident. The lawyer began by summarizing what we all already knew. He spoke of my estate, of its valuation, of the structures in place. He spoke of my son as the sole heir, emphasizing continuity and efficiency. He said that given my recent health scare, it was prudent to ensure there would be no ambiguity moving forward. His voice was calm, reassuring. He slid a document toward me and pointed to a section near the bottom, explaining where my signature would eventually be required. I did not reach for the paper. Instead, I asked him a question about a clause he had mentioned in passing. A small one, he said, standard language. I asked him to read it aloud. He hesitated only briefly before doing so, his tone unchanged as he recited the words. When he finished, I asked him to continue. He looked momentarily confused, then flipped a few pages, scanning. He said that section referred to contingencies and that it had already been addressed in prior revisions. I told him I believed there was an addendum. The room grew quieter then, not tense, just attentive. My son leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing impatience. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and asked which addendum I was referring to. I told him it was the one drafted 3 years earlier, shortly after my last comprehensive review. I mentioned the date. His expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. He opened the folder again, more carefully this time, and began searching through the contents. As he read, I watched my son's face. At first, he seemed unconcerned, confident that whatever was being located would support the narrative he expected. Then I noticed a change, a furrow in his brow, a tightening around the mouth. The lawyer cleared his throat and said there was indeed an additional clause, one that had not been discussed in recent conversations. He apologized for the oversight, saying it had been filed separately due to its conditional nature. He read it aloud. The language was precise, unemotional. It outlined that in the event I remained mentally competent, all assets would remain under my sole control, regardless of age or health status. It further stated that any attempt to exert pressure, formal or informal, to accelerate transfer of assets would result in an immediate restructuring. Under that restructuring, the estate would be placed into a charitable trust, with my son receiving a fixed annual stipend, modest by comparison, and no authority over principal or property. The clause was irrevocable once triggered. No one spoke when he finished. The words hung in the air, clear and complete. My son stared at the document, then at me. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The lawyer shifted in his chair, his professional composure returning quickly. He explained, carefully, that the conditions described had been met, that multiple documented attempts to initiate transfer while I was hospitalized constituted undue pressure under the terms defined, that the restructuring had already been executed the previous week following my confirmation of competence and intent. Everything had been done properly, he assured us. I finally spoke then. I said I had never intended the clause to punish anyone. I said it existed to protect me, to ensure that my voice could not be replaced by assumption. I reminded my son that I had built what I had by paying attention to patterns, not promises. I told him I had hoped the clause would never be needed. I said it quietly, without accusation. He asked why I hadn't told him. I said because it was never meant to be discussed unless it was activated. I said because trust does not require warnings. The lawyer nodded slightly, as if recognizing the truth in that. There was a long pause. My son leaned back in his chair, his hands now flat on the table. He asked what this meant for him. The lawyer explained again, patiently, that he would be provided for, but that control and expectation were no longer part of the arrangement. He said the structure was final. I watched my son absorb this, watched the certainty drain from him, replaced by something unfamiliar. Not rage, not grief, but disorientation. The future he assumed was no longer aligned with reality. I felt no satisfaction in that realization, only a calm acknowledgement that things had reached their natural conclusion. When the meeting ended, my son stood slowly. He looked at me, searching for something I could not give him. He said he needed time to process. I told him I understood. That was true. As we left the building separately, I stepped into the daylight and felt its warmth on my face. The city moved around me unchanged. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No voices had been raised. And yet everything had shifted. The silence that followed was not empty. It was settled. The days after the meeting passed without incident, which in itself felt significant. No calls came from my son. No messages followed to ask for clarification or appeal to emotion. The lawyer sent a brief note confirming what had already been said, outlining next steps in neutral language. I filed it away and returned to my routines. There was no sense of triumph, no release of tension in a dramatic way. Instead, there was a settling, like dust after a door has closed. I noticed how quiet my phone had become. It rested on the table for hours without lighting up, and I realized how much of my anticipation in recent months had been shaped by waiting for it to do so. Without that expectation, time felt different, longer perhaps, but also cleaner. I read in the afternoons, books I had set aside years earlier. I cooked simple meals and ate them slowly. I slept deeply without waking to replay conversations that had already run their course. Friends continued to reach out, unaware of what had transpired. Some asked if I had seen my son recently, how married life was treating him. I answered kindly, vaguely. I said he was busy, that we were both adjusting. There was no need to offer details. This was not a story I felt compelled to explain. The absence between us was not something to be defended. It simply existed. One afternoon, my son did call. His voice sounded careful, as though he were testing unfamiliar ground. He said he had been thinking a great deal. He said he hadn't realized how things had appeared from my perspective. He stopped short of apologizing, but the implication hovered there, incomplete. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a pause, waiting for my response. I told him I believed him. I said understanding often arrives too late to change outcomes, but not too late to inform the future. He asked what the future looked like now. It was an honest question, stripped of expectation. I told him it looked quieter, that I intended to keep it that way. He did not argue. He said he respected that. Whether he truly did or not no longer mattered. Respect does not require proximity. We ended the call politely. When it was over, I sat for a while, holding the phone without looking at it. I felt a faint sadness then, not for what had happened, but for what would not. The easy familiarity, the assumption of belonging. Those things had been eroded over time, not lost in a single moment. Accepting that felt like letting go of an old photograph whose edges had already faded. The consequences of the restructuring began to surface quietly. Invitations I might once have received through my son's social circle no longer arrived. I was removed, gently and without explanation, from certain assumptions. There were no confrontations, no demands, just a gradual redirection, as if the current had shifted and I was no longer in its path. I welcomed it. I spent more time alone, but it did not feel like loneliness. It felt like space reclaimed. I began visiting places without informing anyone, taking short trips, staying in small hotels where no one knew my name. I liked the anonymity, the absence of history. In those places, I was simply a woman moving through her days, unencumbered by expectation. At home, I made changes slowly. I donated items I no longer needed, cleared shelves that had become repositories for obligations rather than memories. I moved a chair closer to the window, repositioned my desk to catch the morning light. These were small acts, but they carried intention. I was shaping an environment that reflected who I was now, not who I had been required to be. Occasionally, I wondered how my son was adjusting, whether the certainty he had relied on would return in another form, whether he would reinterpret the story in a way that preserved his sense of self. I hoped he would, not for my sake, but for his. I had no desire to be remembered as an adversary. I did not see myself that way. I had simply chosen not to disappear quietly. The trust began its work, distributing funds to causes I had long supported without fanfare. I received reports, updates written in measured language. They confirmed that what I had built was now serving a broader purpose. Reading them brought a sense of alignment, not pride but recognition. This, I thought, is what continuity looks like when it is not driven by entitlement. One evening, as I prepared tea, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked older than I remembered, lines deeper, posture more deliberate, but there was something else there too, something steadier. I held that gaze for a moment longer than usual, acknowledging the woman who had navigated this passage without raising her voice. The silence between my son and I remained. It was not hostile, it was simply complete. There were no more documents to sign, no misunderstandings to clarify. What remained was the knowledge that our paths, once assumed to run parallel, had diverged. That knowledge did not ache the way it once might have. It rested quietly, like a truth that no longer needed defending. As night settled, I sat by the window watching the familiar pattern of lights across the street. I felt no urgency to fill the quiet. Tomorrow would come, and with it more ordinary moments shaped by my own choosing. The story was not finished, not yet. There was still a final understanding waiting beyond this separation, one that had nothing to do with inheritance or loss, and everything to do with what remains when expectation falls away. Months passed, and the quiet settled into something I had not expected: freedom. The house, once a place of memories laced with subtle tension, became simply a home again. I moved through it without anticipation, without the weight of assumed responsibilities pressing on me. I woke when I wished, ate when I wished, and allowed the light to fall where it would, unbroken by schedules or reminders. There was a softness in this autonomy, a steady pulse I had long forgotten existed beneath the rhythm of care and expectation. My son's calls became sporadic, polite but distant. He no longer spoke of schedules, of meetings, of money. When he asked about me, it was brief, careful, almost ritualistic. I answered with honesty, not inviting intimacy, not defending boundaries. I noticed that in his voice there was a tempered respect, an acknowledgement of limits he could not cross, and in that restraint I found no resentment, only the quiet recognition that the relationship had changed irrevocably, and that it was better for both of us. I traveled more often, short trips to the coast or the countryside. I walked alone on beaches where no one knew my name, watching the tide erase footprints as effortlessly as time erases certainty. Each step reminded me of the choices I had made, the patience I had cultivated, and the resilience I had never acknowledged in myself until now. There was no rush, no need to perform, no expectation to measure myself against someone else's assumption of my life. The world moved around me, and I moved within it on my own terms. Back at home, I continued to shape my space, not for appearances, not for approval, but to reflect my own sensibilities. I removed objects that reminded me of compliance, of deference, of silent expectation. I arranged books and photographs and papers in ways that felt logical to me alone. I like the way the light caught the edge of a shelf or glimmered across a countertop in the late afternoon. These were small pleasures, unnoticed by anyone else, but no less profound for being private. Letters from the lawyer arrived only occasionally, confirming the trust, reporting its work, reminding me that everything was secure. I did not rush to open them. When I did, I read carefully, noting how the system I had put in place functioned without interference. The money had been redirected quietly, effectively, serving causes I had long valued. There was satisfaction in this, though it was subtle, not boastful. It was the recognition that my choices had weight and that their impact extended beyond the sphere of family drama. I reflected often on the hospital room, the wedding, the conversations, the moments of near expectation. I realized that every tension, every pause, every small act of observation had been a lesson in endurance, in seeing clearly, in measuring the world with patience rather than impulse. I had learned to wait not for vindication, but for understanding. And in that waiting, I had built something unshakable, a life shaped entirely by my own hands, my own mind, and my own rules. I no longer wished for reconciliation with my son, nor did I harbor anger. Our paths had diverged, and that was neither wrong nor tragic. It was simply the way of things. I remembered the times when I had imagined his approval as essential, and I understood now that it had never been necessary. The moments of tension, the subtle manipulations, the quiet assumptions, all of them had prepared me for a freedom I had not known I could claim. Evenings were quiet but not lonely. I sat by the window, watched the lights across the street, and let thoughts drift without judgment. I wrote in my notebook occasionally, though never extensively. I kept records of ideas, observations, fleeting memories. I never shared them. They were mine alone, and that was enough. I understood now that the ultimate peace does not come from vindication or confrontation, but from the simple, unshakable certainty that one's own voice matters most. When the occasional thought of my son arose, it was calm, detached, neither bitter nor longing. I understood the love that had shaped him, but also the assumptions that had separated us. I no longer sought to bridge that gap. I observed it, acknowledged it, and let it exist without interference. I had learned that presence does not always require participation, and absence does not always diminish value. In the end, the inheritance, the legal maneuvers, the meetings, they were all secondary to what I had discovered, the strength to preserve myself quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. I moved through my days with ease, attending to the ordinary and the subtle, the small joys I had once overlooked. The air felt lighter, the sun warmer, the house steadier beneath my hands. I was whole, I was enough. And at last I rested in a freedom I had carved not from conflict, but from patience, foresight, and the unshakable knowledge that my life had always been mine to define.